Hi, everybody. I just wanted to say I'm the director of the Westside Center for Independent Living, and our center, along with several others, received some funding to look into the new housing opportunities and specifically the HUD 811, Section 811 grant proposal that was being prepared to try to assist the state with some better language and to have more inclusive language that would identify better the roles of independent living centers. In addition, we agreed to do this webinar so that we could offer our brothers and sister organizations around the state a chance to know a little bit more about what housing opportunities are, especially in this post-Redevelopment Act environment. As some of you may know, the state, due to its budgetary crisis, was forced to eliminate the redevelopment agencies around the state. So almost 400 agencies lost their funding, and as a result of that, much of the local opportunities for building affordable housing were also lost. This money used to be taken out of local funds that were tax increments and is now being given directly to the state. So there are a number of us who are participating today. Sarah Triano and Michael Allen are representing the Independent Living Center in the Silicon Valley area. And I don't see her on here, but I believe Leslie is representing the Placer County Independent Living Center. And we are, as I said, the Westside Center for Independent Living. We will be doing kind of a history of the movement and an overview in the first section about what 811 is and what the Frank Melville Housing Investment Act is and so forth. And then in the second session, which we hope you'll all join us for, we'll be talking about where we go from here, new opportunities for collaboration, new ways to look at funding affordable housing in a post-California Redevelopment Act environment and so forth. So beginning now, I think we have Michael Allen and Sarah Triano starting the webinar here with their presentation, and I'll let them further introduce themselves now.
So I'm Michael Allen. I'm a civil rights lawyer in Washington, D.C. And over the years, I've spent about 10 years working in legal services practice on behalf of low-income people. 11 years after that at the Bazelon Center for Mental Health Law in Washington, D.C., focused on the whole cluster of issues that has to do with services, housing, and supports to keep people in the most integrated setting. And for the last 7 years or so here at Relman, Dane & Colfax, a civil rights law firm. And my practice is divided between litigation over disability civil rights issues in housing, principally, including accessible housing and most integrated settings, and other sorts of civil rights litigation focused on other protected classes based on race or national origin or familial status. My assignment here today is just to take you a little bit through the concepts that underlie the issues of accessible housing, both housing that's affordable and housing that's physically accessible to people with disabilities, but to do so in the context of talking about the law and the way in which that sets us up to talk about the disability movement's relationship with accessible housing, and particularly with the Section 811 program. The first thing I want to say is that we've got a couple of good, strong federal civil rights laws, the Fair Housing Act and the ADA, both of which explicitly talk about a clear and comprehensive national mandate to have people with disabilities as part of the American economic and social mainstream. The idea here, like the civil rights movement based on race and national origin, is explicitly about integration. And so as I talk about various housing models and legal schemes, I want you to think about that concept of integration as being critical to the kind of work that we do. Historically, we all know that American housing policy hasn't done a very good job of moving our folks into the American mainstream, that folks with disabilities are typically thought of as needing some different kind or special housing In fact, in many places, states still talk about the needs of people with disabilities for housing in terms of the number of beds or slots that they need, and not the number of homes. And I hope that as we encounter various mainstream agencies here and folks in the public, that we're careful with our language, that we're always talking about homes and opportunities and not about beds and slots. The reason I say that is that old language is really born out of the idea that people with disabilities live somewhere else, out of sight and out of mind, whether it's in the large hospitals, state hospitals of years gone by, whether it's these days increasingly in nursing homes. Many older people, particularly older people with some money, have lots of other housing options out there for them, but these old nursing homes continue to have beds and slots that people want filled, and I'm involved in litigation around the country about the re-institutionalization of younger people with disabilities in nursing home settings. Other places, like in New York, have things called adult homes, which are run by private interests, but that end up warehousing people with disabilities, people with the same kind of diagnosis or same perception in the public mind, often end up living segregated in these institutions, many institutions in the community. And quite frankly, there are many states that still use the group home model, whether it's large or small group homes or board and care homes, as a primary housing stock for people with disabilities. All of these models have the fault of being segregated and being isolated. I think if we take seriously the congressional mandate behind the ADA and the Fair Housing Act, we would be talking about community integration in the context of everybody with a disability being able to live in housing like where you and I live. The idea is that it ought not to be labeled, it ought not to be segregated, it ought not to be stigmatized. I want to say just a couple of words about the ADA and the integration mandate, because I think it helps to inform why there has been a movement over the course of the last 10, 15, 20 years. It's too slow, but it's still a movement in the direction of allowing people greater access. The underlying case, which we know as Olmstead, started with two women in a psychiatric hospital in Georgia. Their legal aid lawyer sued under the ADA and took several years to get to the Supreme Court, but when it finally did, the Supreme Court said that unnecessary institutionalization in the context of a psychiatric hospital is a form of discrimination, and that the states would be obligated to create community-based settings. But increasingly, since '99, advocates have been pressing and pushing on the text of the ADA to expand beyond the conventional sense of what an institution is to the really revolutionary approach of services and programs and supports that are absolutely integrated into the community and not separate. So the ADA says it's discrimination when you treat people with disabilities differently, if you exclude them from services or shuttle them off into places that are specialized services for people with disabilities. And all of those federal programs out there, all those federal rights that constrain what states and municipalities must do when they offer these public programs, require them to do it in the most integrated setting appropriate to people with disabilities. And then the Department of Justice, in writing its regulation, went one step further to actually define what most integrated setting means. A setting that enables people with disabilities to interact with non-disabled persons to the fullest extent possible. As we measure every housing program in the communities where we live and work, we need to ask, does this program do that? The bottom line, I think, in Olmstead, and it teaches us this with every public service out there, every program, support, housing, and otherwise for people with disabilities, must avoid this unjustified isolation. It must focus on community-based services, because to do otherwise relegates people to places that are separate and isolated, that communicate to the public that people with disabilities are incapable or unworthy of participating in community life. That kind of institutionalization that the Supreme Court condemned also recognized that unless people are integrated into the community, they don't have a chance to be engaged in family relations and social context, work options, educational advancement, cultural enrichment. This is all the language of the Supreme Court, recognizing that when we separate people with disabilities, we do so at the risk of cutting them off from community life. So that's my soapbox. I'll get off it now and pass the mic to Sarah.
All right, thanks, Michael. What I'm going to do now is just kind of put the housing issue in the context of the independent living movement. This may be repetition for some of you, but for some of you it may be new as well. So I want to start by telling you a little story about a man named Ed. In the fall of 1962, when James Meredith became the first African-American student to attend Ole Miss, that same fall, there was a gentleman named Ed Roberts who became the first student with a significant physical disability to be admitted to the University of California at Berkeley. He had contracted polio at the age of 14, was paralyzed from the neck down, and when he got to UC Berkeley, of course, all of the dorms and student housing was completely inaccessible to him. So the university let him live in the campus hospital because there was no other accessible student housing, and none of the residential buildings could support the weight of his 800-pound iron lung that he slept in at night. So word got out around the country that Ed was there, and more students with significant physical disabilities started applying to Cal and getting in, and by 1967, Cal Hospital, the university hospital, was home to 12 students with significant disabilities. And while they were there, a majority of them had a disability called quadriplegia, and so they developed a sense of community while they were all locked there in the hospital together, and based on the barriers and discrimination that they all faced, and they decided to call themselves the Rolling Quads. So California Department of Rehabilitation counselor, while they were going to school, determined that Ed and one of the other Rolling Quads were unemployable. A lot of folks know about that, but they don't know about this next part. The Department of Rehabilitation counselor also said that they should be kicked out of school and that they should be sent to a nursing home. And Ed and the Rolling Quads protested. They demanded that the counselor be reassigned and that the students be reinstated at the college. And as a result of their protest, there was actually a psychiatrist within the Department of Rehabilitation who threatened to institutionalize all of the Rolling Quads and throw them all into a nursing home. So they stepped up their advocacy efforts, went to the local newspapers, the state backed down. They reassigned the counselor, and they reinstated the students to the university. But after this experience, Ed and the Rolling Quads were adamant in their belief that people with disabilities should be integrated into the community and have a right to live in accessible, affordable, integrated housing among friends and families in communities of our choosing. And this belief was a key part of the founding of CIL in Berkeley in 1971, and independent living centers throughout California and the nation and world have really worked on helping folks with disabilities to gain access to accessible, affordable, integrated housing ever since that time. Today, housing is a required service of all independent living centers in California. We're required to offer one-on-one assistance to folks with disabilities in locating affordable and accessible housing, as well as to access housing programs. But despite this, 41 years later, after Ed and the Rolling Quads had their fight, the lack of accessible, affordable, integrated housing is one of the greatest barriers people with disabilities face today in our state and throughout the nation. And it's particularly acute for folks living in rural areas, which I'm sure Leslie will talk a little more about. But I'm going to turn it back to Mike and Jeff right now for an overview of the HUD 811 program.
Good. This is Michael, and I understand that I've got a couple of quick things to say at the beginning, and Jeff will then bring us up to date in terms of the ways in which the 811 program is beginning to morph in a direction that would be more consistent with the integration mandate that we've talked about. The Section 811 statute was born in the early 1990s, and its purpose, as you can see on the screen, is to enable persons with disabilities to live with dignity and independence within their communities by expanding the supply of supportive housing. Supportive housing in the modern context is housing that's designed to meet people's needs, that is, physical needs for access and ability to do all the things one does in the course of a day. The 811 program was initially constructed in a way to make supportive services available that address the individual needs of people who live in 811 properties. And finally, this idea of promoting community integration was built in from the beginning. The difficulty is that as our conception of what independence and community integration has advanced, we've gotten to a place that looks more like the integration mandate. In the early days, though, the supportive housing that got created for people with disabilities was focused principally on two things: providing a capital advance, that is to say, money up front to build new housing. And typically a lot of that housing got built in a way that tended to be segregated. That is to say, project sponsors were people who were affiliated, say, with United Cerebral Palsy or affiliated with the National Alliance on Mental Illness. And those sponsors built properties that were for people in those specific diagnosis groups and provided services that were tailored to people with those kinds of needs. So not only did we get housing in which people with disabilities were segregated from people without, but we also ended up with housing communities that essentially had single diagnosis occupancy. Between 1990 and 2008, about 28,000 units of Section 811 housing were created. Now, anytime that we add 28,000 units of housing for people with disabilities, that has to be a good thing, given how dramatically underserved most of our communities are. But the discussion I think that we're having today, and when we think about the new version of the Section 811 program in which California and independent living centers in California want to participate, we realize that there's a separate value set that we might want to really take a look at. As I said, what got built for 20 years under the Section 811 program was principally what are called single-purpose projects, as I've previously described. Some of them were built as small group homes. Some were built as what they were calling independent living rental complexes. For the most part, not more than 24 units, although there were places in the country where that number was exceeded regularly, on the argument that it's more efficient to put a larger number of units all together in one place serving one population or a disability group. Very few of what we would think of as housing that looks like where you and I live. So, you know, no standard integrated apartments in which people with and without disabilities lived. You know, no condominiums and cooperatives, no kind of mainstream or normalized housing. And I think this is my cue probably to turn it back over to Jeff to talk a little bit about the way in which 811 is beginning to morph.
Hello? Okay, my name is Jeff Michelson, and I'm a system change advocate and so a benefits advocate here at the Olmstead Center for Independent Living, and I've been really pleased to be able to work on this project. So my section here is, okay, so, so your section is actually coming up here.
Oh, sorry, yep, that's my section.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay. Jeff, do you want me to go ahead and do this, and then you can continue after that?
Yep. Why don't we go the order that it was in? I apologize.
Oh, no, we are.
Let Sarah take it.
Yeah.
Is Sarah going to take it?
Sarah, are you on?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, this is Sarah. I'll go ahead and take it.
Okay.
So Michael already kind of covered some of the concerns that the disability and independent living movement has had with the 811 program. I'm going to just talk about them just a little bit more, and also address an issue about ILCs owning and operating housing. There's a national advocacy organization called DRAC, Disability Rights Action Coalition for Housing, and which includes some advocates like Karen Tamley, Beto Barrera, Daryl Price, and they've been advocating for increasing the stock of accessible, affordable, integrated housing options for folks with disabilities for years, and they have been highly critical of the Section 811 program, because even though, as Michael said, it was designed to really promote inclusion and integration, one of the unintended consequences of it has been the segregation of people with disabilities. In their 2010 report, the National Council on Disability found that, quote, the 811 program has contributed to the segregation of people with disabilities from people without disabilities, and also by different disabilities. So what this means really is the 811 housing projects can target people with physical disabilities, developmental disabilities, and chronic mental illness, or a combination of these three. But developers can request a waiver from HUD that allows them to target the project that they're making, not just to one of those groups, but also to subcategories within those groups. So say there's a developer that wants to build a housing project for people with autism only, and that allows them to actually deny housing to someone in that project who has a developmental disability, but it's not autism. So it created this really highly segregated model based on diagnosis, as Michael was saying. Another concern that DRAC has raised with the 811 program, and with most housing programs for folks with disabilities, is the practice of linking housing and services. So for a long time, in order to get housing in certain projects, you had to accept the services offered too, like say personal care assistance, or there may be other services, even if you didn't like them or didn't want them. And oftentimes the services come with a case manager who oversees the services and you as the person with a disability. But as Michael was just saying, folks with disabilities should have the right to, have housing just like anybody else. Nobody else has to accept services. But and folks with disabilities aren't cases that need to be managed. IL philosophy holds that we're people who have the freedom to make choices, including mistakes, and to manage our own lives. Accepting management and services shouldn't be a requirement for obtaining housing. As I was just saying, no one else in society has to accept services or be managed to get housing, so why should we? What services we receive to live independently and who provides them really should be our choice as people with disabilities. But you'll see this, and in fact it did come up in the state's 811 application where they wanted to have on-site managers to manage the folks with disabilities who live there. So just something to be aware of. And then the third and final concern that DRAC raised, which is not necessarily specific to the 811 program, but is specific to independent living centers, was the practice of many ILCs owning and operating housing for people with disabilities. So some of the ILCs actually, became developers, got 811 funds, and created segregated housing projects. And independent living centers were created to promote equal choice, inclusion, and integration of people with disabilities into society, and this practice was clearly violating that mandate. So in 1994, the Code of Federal Regulations was amended to actually say that by law, independent living centers are non-residential. And what that means is that we cannot operate or manage housing or shelter for individuals as an IL service on either a temporary or long-term basis unless the housing or shelter is incidental to the overall operation of the center, necessary so that the individual may receive an IL service, and limited to a period not to exceed 8 weeks during any 6-month period. So I think this is something to really be aware of, especially in California, where I've seen some independent living centers who are really promoting the idea that we should own housing, just to be aware of the historical background of why we don't own housing and why it's important not to create segregated housing options for folks with disabilities. So again, I'm going to turn it back to, I think, Jeff now, and Michael to discuss these concerns and national efforts to amend and reform the 811 program.
This is Michael. I think it does come back to me just for a couple of slides, and I'm sorry, Jeff, for having handed the baton at the wrong moment. I just wanted to give us some historical context again. The idea of the community being concerned about the 811 program goes back many years. In 1959, Congress first authorized the use of the Section 202 program, which had been just for older people, to begin to serve people with disabilities. And from 59 till about 1990, the 202 program grudgingly let in people with disabilities, younger people with disabilities, typically allowing project managers to pick and choose which disability populations to serve. So not unlike what Sarah was just saying a moment ago. You'd get the 202 program that would say, well, we take older people and then we'll also take people with physical disabilities, or we'll take people with what at the time was called mental retardation. But they could pick and choose the categories, and they could essentially create, these subpopulations. Well, in 1990, Congress, not for completely the right reasons, created the Section 811 program. A little bit of history. In the late 80s and up until 1990, both in the privately owned, federally subsidized housing stock and in the public housing arena, the mixing of people with disabilities and seniors began to give rise to some tension. And basically, the senior lobby came to Washington in the late 80s and early 90s and got Congress essentially to write in new provisions that would separate those two groups again, so that people with disabilities would not have as ready access to the private programs nor to the public housing programs. And anyway, in the wake of all of this, the Section 811 program was created. It was chopped out of 202. It was funded at a pretty low level. I mean, we're talking about a program that might have created between 500 and 1,000 units each year across the entire country. So it was an under-resourced program, and it continued to be a program that was segregating. Gradually, through the work of DRAC and other advocates, there came to be what I'd say was a grudging acceptance of the fact that this 811 program, which had focused on capital advances for building new housing, often which was segregated, should give way, at least in part, to the idea of tenant-based subsidies. So beginning in '92, DRAC actually got Congress and HUD to approve a fraction of the 811 money to go to tenant-based vouchers. Like the regular Section 8 program, a tenant could use that voucher to pay a portion of her rent wherever she chose to live, as opposed to just living in the units that had been created under the Section 811 program. Gradually, the pressure increased throughout the 90s to do more with respect to this, and DRAC and NCD, as Sarah said, pushed for 100% of the Section 811 program to be converted to tenant-based subsidies so that people really had a choice about where they were going to live. NCD, in fact, said, the conversion of this program from building-based to person-based is consistent with the Rehabilitation Act and the Fair Housing Act. Gradually, there was some pushback from groups that are organized and known as CCD, or the Consortium for Citizens with Disabilities in Washington, D.C. I think the push and pull that occurred between groups like DRAC and CCD is what got us to the place where there was consideration of the Melville Supportive Housing Investment Act of 2008. And now I think, Jeff, is the time that I pass the baton to you, and you can talk about what that program has looked like for the last few years.
All right. So, sorry for that little confusion there. Hopefully we're back on track. So, what I had done in part of this project was to read through the NOFA that was actually released by HUD, which parallels, of course, the language that was passed. What had happened, a little bit of background, was that there was a bill known as Senate Bill 1596 several months back, and I believe it was authored by Senator Murray out of Washington. Anyhow, what had happened was a lot of money was cut from HUD. Part of, I think, what had happened was that the 811 money was sort of filled in a little bit of it, so that there was a little bit of a victory, at least for our the interest that we serve here. So this funding became available in part because of the Herman Melville Charitable Trust through the Supportive Housing Investment Act of 2010, and HUD had worked on it with the Department of Health and Human Services, and that of course is what led to this funding that is now available. There's a little bit of a misprint here. On the next slide, it says the Frank Melville Supportive Housing Investment Act, and it says 20120. So obviously that's not right. It's 2010. And so what I say is, what is the Investment Act? So the Act here, it has the statute where you find it, and what it was really meant to do, and just sort of reiterating what Michael had already said, was to really revitalize the 811 program, because it had sort of languished, and there were just not that many units that were being created for this purpose. So this bill was an attempt to, or is an attempt to, really revitalize the program, and I think really spurn sort of a competitive atmosphere within the states to find the best way to create the community supports and also the integration of housing. So as you can see, the bill here was signed on January 4th, 2011, and it appropriated $85 million for the creation of affordable housing for very low-income people. And of course, reiterating what Michael has said, is the idea, of course, is to create integrated housing in a non-discriminatory manner. So 25% of the allocation is for people with disabilities, and so that we don't have a situation where we have housing that is only reserved for people with a certain type of disability. So what I've written here in the next slide is what are some of the aspects that are distinguishable and improve the new Section 811 program. And so what it really does is that the leases are authorized for not less than 1 year and cannot be terminated unless there's serious violations, which is, I think, fairly consistent with the laws that are already that are in place now with HUD. The housing options could include multifamily developments, condominiums, independent living facilities, and cooperative housing, sort of to expand the different venues that might be available to accommodate people with disabilities. And
Samantha, please call reception. Correction.
Multifamily and integrated housing, of course, is a key principle that's promoted, and that's, of course, the reason for the 25% allocation is really to, as I already stated, create situations where you have people with whatever disability it might be living with people who don't have a certain disability, and so that it doesn't create that discriminatory isolation or stigma. So really what I did was when I looked through the 811 NOFA, the Notice of Funding Availability that HUD had released, is what I really noticed the most was that there's really an effort on the part of HUD, and also I believe Secretary of Disabilities with the Department of Health and Human Services, to really force the states to really act competitively and utilize their full resources to create the most integrated housing and really create a competition. So it's really, the idea is to maximize as I just said, the resources by creating partnerships between the different departments within states. So really what was required was that in this NOFA was that that you had to have a situation where only the states could apply. So in order to be a qualified applicant, you had to be a state, and the state had to have a situation where the low-income housing credit agency was going to partner with the agency that would administer Medicaid. And of course, here in California, that's the Department of Healthcare Services. And I don't know how many of you know Joel, but Joel, of course, is one of the key principal participants with long-term care division with DHCS, and he was very much involved in this. So the unique requirement is really to really have all aspects available for funding, both public, private, and developers, and bringing in to bear the expertise of the different state administrative agencies. And then I also write here that there's really you want to co-locate the community-based services with the housing so that you have medical services and so forth, transportation, counseling, whatever you can bring to the situation. I think this is kind of reiterating what's already been said, and I think we know that how community benefits facilitate Olmstead, because you're going to have a situation where more and more people are able to live independently if, in fact, they have the support services to do that, so that they do not need to be isolated. And, of course, the more services that are available, the greater the opportunity for that. I think that wraps it up for me. Yep. Okay, and that will be it. Thank you.
I guess we now move on to some questions at this point, unless Michael or Sarah, you have anything more you want to add at the moment.
I think I've said enough.
I have nothing to add.
So then, Rosemarie, how do we turn this over to questions? Or do people write them out, or do they speak them, or what?
As options, for those of you that are on the teleconference, you can press *6 to unmute your line to ask questions. And then for those of you in the webinar platform, you can use the chat feature to type in your questions if you don't have access to a microphone headset. If you do have access to a microphone headset, feel free to, you can use the hand raise feature just so that we are sort of moderating the questions to give you an opportunity to ask. So, okay, so there is a question from Mark.
What is the status of the 811 application? Do you want to address that, Jeff? Hang on one second. Jeff is coming back to the mic.
Okay. So, last I heard that HUD has not announced where the awards will be.
I'm not hearing you, Jeff.
You're not hearing me?
Come over here and use.
Last I had heard was that the HUD had not announced yet who the who had been awarded the grant yet. But I do know that all of the states that participate in the MFP, money follows the person, of course here in California it's CCT, had applied for this funding. And to date that has not been released to the best of my knowledge from HUD. Obviously California did apply, and the proposal that they did put together that I read I thought was very extensive, and there were several agencies in California that participated in the low income housing tax credit committee, and Housing and Community Development, and of course the Department of Health Care Services all applied for, or were named in this in the narrative that was sent off to HUD. And so of course the state is anxiously waiting, and hopefully we will receive the award.
And this is Sarah. I'll just add too that their HUD is only going to award 16 states. Only 16 states will get this, so it's a very, very competitive application. But California was one of the states that was chosen for a site visit from HUD, and several of us participated in the site visit. So we're keeping our fingers crossed that the state will be awarded the application, but we have not heard anything yet.
Okay, any other questions? I'll read that. Assuming we do get it, what's the best strategy? Work with cities or directly with developers? I'm going to put Layla Kumar on right now, who will answer that question to the best of her ability.
Hi there. Good morning, everyone. I'm going to talk extensively about outreach strategies and relationship development at all levels in the second part of the webinar, so I encourage you to join us. But the answer is really you want to approach local government and private developers. So stay tuned for more details on that.
We're going to take a little break, and we'll be resuming the second part of this webinar at 11:15